Hey, what's up folks? Welcome to another video here on the channel. My name is David, and today we're talking about that piece of wood hanging up on the wall. You know, someone recently asked me to share more about my mandolin collection, and I actually only have 2 mandolins, which I'm realizing now is kind of a shocking thing for someone who claims to make a living with this particular instrument, because we all love collecting mandolins and getting different sounds out of stuff, but I really just have a couple instruments. You know, I've got this old flat iron mandolin that's been hanging on the wall recently. This was my main instrument back in the day when I was making a lot of Mandolin Mondays videos and playing with Missy Rains, but now I just kind of keep it around in cross tunings just for a fun change of pace, and I mainly just play this instrument back here. This is my Piteous Vanguard F5 mandolin. It's been my main instrument for a little over 5 years now, and I've really traveled all over the world with it. We've been to Australia, New Zealand, Japan, France, England, Ireland, Canada, and all over the States. And this is the mando that I've used on pretty much all of my recorded projects. I recorded the Golden Angle, my solo record from a few years back on this thing, all of my work with Mile 12, the stuff I've done with Cup of Joe and the Foreign Landers, and a bunch of other folks as well. And of course, if you followed along with any of the videos here on the YouTube channel, then you've seen and heard this thing quite a lot. So I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to indulge myself and get to share a little bit more about the specs, the sound, and all the different things that I love about this instrument. And just a disclaimer here, I'm not getting paid to make this video. I really just love this thing and I love talking about it. So if you're into all those nerdy details, then here we go. Well, here it is, and I don't know if I've ever formally introduced you guys to this instrument, but this guy is named Stan, as in Stan the Mandolin. That's cheesy, I know, but I just had to do it. And this guy, Stan, is an Piteous Vanguard F5 mandolin built in 2016. And usually I have a bunch of fancy accessories on this mandolin, like a tone guard and an armrest and a bunch of other stuff that you can see over here in this video on mandolin accessories. But for now, I'll just keep it all exposed here so you can see the natural beauty of this thing. And the luthier who builds these instruments is a guy named Oliver Apitius, who lives up in Ontario, Canada. And he's been building for over 40 years now, which blows my mind. And over those years, tons of notable players have played his instruments. Folks like Adam Steffi, Emery Lester, Ashley Broder, Dan Tyminski. Recently, Don Sternberg has been playing one of his jazz models, which is really cool too. I actually met Oliver for the first time at the IBMA convention in Raleigh, North Carolina, one of my favorite spots. Me and Tawatha actually met there too, so I have a lot of fond memories of that place. And I met Oliver the year after he had just redone his workshop and redesigned a lot of elements about the specs and the plans for the instruments that he was building. I remember because he brought basically one of the first batches of these new instruments to the trade show, and this was one of them. And that year at IBMA, I spent a lot of time with Oliver and a lot of time with his instruments, and this Vanguard mandolin just really spoke to me. And before you know it, here we are. But let's get into the nitty-gritty details here, and let me share some of the specs for this particular mandolin here if you're interested. This Vanguard mandolin, like many other modern mandolins out there, is kind of modeled after those 1923 and 1924 Lloyd Loar mandolins that Gibson put out. They're the legendary kind of industry standard for a lot of mandolins these days. So there are some standard appointments that you would expect. And to start with, we got this piece of wood here that the top is made of. This is quarter sawn spruce, and Oliver does hand carving on pretty much all the wood here, which is, I think, amazing. Also, we've got this beautiful back, this 2-piece back of figured maple, along with these sides, which might be kind of my favorite part of the entire mandolin. Just lovely, lovely figuring on this wood. And all the wood on this instrument has been hand stained in a black cherry spirit varnish, so you can see kind of the red tones in the center, and it gets really dark and moody as it goes towards the outside of the mandolin. And then Oliver uses a French polish for a finish, applied by hand as well, to get kind of a really nice combo between a glossy, shiny look and more of a matte vintage finish. And kind of a similarity to those Lloyd Loar mandolins is that this mandolin has this beautiful binding around the entire instrument. And a fun feature here is that the body of the mandolin is what they call top bound, where you see there's this black line that intersects the binding from this perspective, but not from the side perspective. But then on the neck and on the peg head, this is what they call side bound binding, where there's the black line on the side of the binding, but not from the top. Speaking of the neck, this is also another piece of maple that's been angle cut and tapered for a really nice slope on the peg head here. On top of the headstock, we have this hand-sawn pearl shell flower pot inlay. And we've got some really standard mother of pearl dots on the fretboard for inlays as well. We got this ebony fretboard that's radiused a bit. Hopefully you can see it's a little bit of a curve there. The specific numbers are 7 1/4 inch at the top and then 12 inch here at the bottom, I think. Honestly, I don't really know what that means. I'm way out of my element when it comes to measurement stuff like this. But you know, the gist of a radius fretboard is that the frets in the fretboard curve to kind of meet your fingers in the same concave way that your fingers bend. So theoretically, it should make it easier to hold down the frets and make more complex shapes and do harder things. And to me, it may be a placebo, but I do like the way it feels. It feels more comfortable, a little bit more natural. Also on the end of the fretboard here, you can see there's a really nice scooped extension, or what some people call the Florida, because it looks like Florida. And I really like the scooped extensions because it helps eliminate that nasty pick click that you get when the pick bangs against the wood. And then for the more mechanical parts of the mandolin here, we have these Waverly tuning machines on the back of the peg head here, which works surprisingly pretty well. It stays in tune most of the time. And then we've got this James tailpiece here that has been beautifully engraved by Oliver. And then Oliver builds his own bridges as well. This is a 2-piece hand-carved bridge, which has a pretty unique design. And you can see it's even a bit taller than some other bridges out there on different mandolins. And that pretty steep neck set and the tall bridge here is a unique aspect of this build that is a bit of a departure from the Lloyd Loar mandolins. And there are a few other really intentional design aspects here that make this mandolin stand out. For one, we also have a very steep recurve here on the outside of the top and the back. And that's a feature that I think really affects the sound. I don't know too much about how this works, but the way Oliver describes it to me is that he carves the top of the mandolins at a special graduation specification. He calls it a piteous arching. And apparently it's a lot thicker in the center of the top here. And then as the top spans out towards the sides, it gets thinner and thinner. It's hard to show it on camera, but this side of the F-hole is actually thicker than the far side of the F-hole. And then this sharp recurve around the edge is to almost imitate the same shape as a speaker head. So you have basically a top that's meant to project outwards. And then another unique feature about the top of the mandolin here that you may have noticed is that this mandolin has really small F-holes compared to other F-style mandolins. Oliver calls these old world F-holes, and they're actually intentionally tuned to this thing called, I think it's called a Helmholtz frequency of C4 to C#4, which is way above my pay grade. Also on the underside of the mandolin, Oliver uses 2 scallop tone bars to help make the sound production for this instrument. And lastly, there's just been a few tweaks and changes that I've made to the mandolin since I've owned it. And the first thing I did was change the thinner, more vintage style wire frets that originally came with this mandolin with these thicker banjo wire style frets. And these are actually made out of the EVO gold fret wire, which I like a lot. You know, I've had this mandolin for 5 years and I've only had the frets dressed once in that time, which is pretty unheard of. And another tweak was this change to the nut. This is actually the original piece of bone that came with the mandolin, but you can see there's actually a different material that's under the E string side. I had Luthier Dan Voigt over in Nashville, Tennessee, cut a piece of mother of pearl and put it underneath the E string side. And that's kind of a weird thing. I haven't seen too many other luthiers or mandolin players do that, but I really love what it did for the sound because it felt like it really beefed up the high end on this mandolin where I could dig into that E string a lot more without worrying about it being shrill or overpowering. Also on the side here, I did install a K&K twin pickup on the end pin here, but I don't think it changes the natural sound of the instrument. It's just really handy to have on the odd gig when the microphone just doesn't cut through. So those are all the specs that I can possibly think of, but beyond all those heady details, you know, what does this actually sound like and what does it feel like? And those are the things that I'm really drawn to in an instrument. And from the start, there's been a lot about this thing that's really stood out to me. And honestly, the first thing that I noticed about this mandolin is how comfortable the neck feels whenever you put your hand around it. I was used to playing with a bit of a more narrow, thin neck on my flat iron, and this one just felt so natural. There's tons of space for my fingers on the fretboard, and it didn't feel too big either. It wasn't cumbersome or it wasn't uncomfortable to really play. It just felt natural. The next thing that I love about this instrument is how much sustain that it has. For some reason, this thing doesn't want to give up. In particular, the D string just wants to ring out forever. Still going. Sustain is such a big consideration for me because the mandolin just has a very quick decay in the sound department, so the more chances of the sound coming across to a listener, the better, in my opinion. Another aspect kind of in hand with that is just the clarity of tone that this mandolin gets. It's a very modern sounding mandolin, kind of akin to a lot of Alison Krauss, Union Station, Nickel Creek style recordings, but it just cuts through in a band setting in a way that I hadn't experienced before. When I first joined Mile 12 and was having to keep up with BB and Bronwyn and all their amazing stuff on banjo and fiddle, playing in a full bluegrass band, this was a huge leg up on being able to hear myself and being able to be heard by other people. In addition to that, I just think it's a louder instrument than any of the other mandolins that I've owned previously, which is so nice. It feels like you have some extra headroom to work with. Not to say that you always have to play loud, but it makes it easier to play quieter too, because it feels like you're not having to work quite as hard. On top of all that, it's a really nice experience on the left hand too, because like I mentioned, with the wider fretboard, the strings are spaced really comfortably, and as you go up the mandolin neck, all those notes just feel so equal in touch and response. It's a real joy to play. I'll put this tone guard back on there so you can hear it in its full effect, but here's a bit of that tune Gray Eagle I'd like to play. Well, there you go. That's my mandolin. And if you want to hear more recorded work with this thing, you can check out all these videos here on the YouTube channel, or my work on Spotify, my solo projects, my work with those bands that I mentioned. And thanks so much for listening. But now I want to hear from you. Leave a comment in the section below here and let me know what mandolin you're playing and what you love about it. And we'll keep this nerdy train going all night long. And thank you guys so much for watching this really indulgent video. I hope some of this information was helpful or interesting. And if you want to support the page, all those subscribes go a long way, or you can sign up over on Patreon and get access to a bunch of additional mandolin content and learning resources. There's more info in the link below, but until then, I'll see you in the next video.